America's
Safeguarding
defense
America
strength
requires
comes
speed.
from the people who
It takes
build
tech,
welders,
advanced tech,
machinists,
defense tech,
and others
and it
who
depends
produce
on
the equipment our
expertise.
military relies on.
Lockheed Martin's
And while
homeland
demand
defense
is rising,
capabilities
the
aren't
number
just
of
layered
skilled
and
workers
sophisticated.
hasn't. But the
They're
GE
fielded,
Aerospace
proven,
Foundation
and
the
protecting
company
lives
are
around the
stepping
globe.
up. The
In
foundation
other words,
is launching a
they're
$30
ready,
million
ready to
program
deliver
to train
mission
10,000
integration on an
workers in
unprecedented
advanced
scale.
manufacturing.
And so are
the
we.
program will
Learn
expand
more at
instructor ranks, provide modern equipment,
LockheedMartin.com/GoldenDome.
update courses to match
I'm Ben
industry
Watson, and
credentials,
welcome
and
to
lower
Defense One
cost
Radio.
barriers, allowing graduates to step directly onto the line or into the hangar. These efforts are helping grow the skilled workforce the defense industrial
Paul
base
Stairs
needs.
is the
Learn
General
more
John W.
at
Vesey, Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention,
GEAerospace.com/workforce.
and the Director of the Center for Preventive
I'm Ben
Action
Watson,
at
and
the Council
welcome
on
to
Foreign
Defense One
Relations. He's also the author of CFR's annual Preventive Priorities Survey, where hundreds of foreign policy experts rank which potential and ongoing topics and conflicts
On this,
they
our
believe are most
200th
likely
episode of
next
the
year.
podcast.
And
My
how
colleague
those might
Patrick
affect
Tucker
US
and I
national security.
welcome back our
Paul
very
Stairs,
first guest
welcome
on the
to
show.
Defense One Radio.
It's
Paul
great to
Shari
be here,
is
Ben.
the Executive
Thank you
Vice
for having
President
me
at
on
the
your show
Washington-based think tank.
Thank you
the
for
Center
agreeing to
for a New
speak
American
ahead of the
Security.
holiday here.
He's
and ahead
also
of
a former
the new
Army
year.
Ranger
As
and the
this
author of several
report
books,
kind of prepares
including
all of us for.
Four
So,
Battlegrounds, Power
to begin,
in the Age of Artificial
can you tell our
Intelligence,
listeners a
and
bit about
Army of
yourself?
None.
Autonomous
I see this
weapons and
particular
the future
project
of
for
war.
CFR goes back to
2 years ago,
2007,
Time
and from
magazine
what I
named
can
Paul
tell,
one of the
you have played a
100
key role in it
most
going back
influential
at
people
least
in
12
artificial
years.
intelligence.
So I've
Paul
been
Shari,
at the
it's
council
been 7
now
years since we
for
first spoke.
close to
Welcome back to
I think
Defense One
16,
Radio.
17 years or
Well,
so.
thanks for having me back, and congratulations on
I
such a
work
successful
primarily
200
on
episodes.
areas of
Well,
conflict
thank you. Yes,
and
it's
instability
been
that could
quite a lot. We've
threaten
done a
US
lot of varied
interests and trying to think
formats,
of ways
and
to
I'm kind of proud of the work that
lessen
we
that
have done.
risk to try to
So thank you for that. I really
best,
appreciate it. And thanks for
prevent
being a
it
part of the very
from,
first day.
various threats from occurring
all
in
right,
the first
so,
place.
hey, actually going back
and
to
if
that time, back in
doesn't work, trying to
2018,
sort of minimize
to the extent that we at Defense One
the
talked about
negative
artificial
consequences
intelligence,
if indeed
it was largely through the lens of a
they do
pretty
occur.
quiet
So,
Pentagon program at the time.
we
A
began
program with
this,
Google known as Project Maven.
and
as I understood it,
initiated this
the AI
project,
helped scan
18
terabytes of
years
drone and
ago
surveillance
now,
footage over the
and,
Middle East, for example.
The goal
to assist
really
in
was to
locating
try to
targets the U.S. military
sensitize
could
U.S.
strike during
foreign
war
policy
analysis.
advisors.
Now, one of the things I'd like to do in
sources
our
of
discussion
instability
today
of
is
conflict,
to tell the story of how the
sort of
technology
just
has
over
evolved
the
since
horizon
then.
over
So,
the next 12
to
months.
get us started,
It's
what
very
more do you
difficult
think
for
it would be helpful to note
busy
about the
policymakers to try to
understanding
focus
and use of
on,
AI in its
on
infancy
threats
back
that may
during
or may
the
not
first term of
occur?
President
And
Trump?
so the goal was
and,
to try to get
perhaps
them to
even
focus
earlier,
on
if you like.
those
We're basically
that
just getting
really
started, and then
demanded
we'll kind of
their
form a
attention,
contrast with where we are
particularly
now.
Yeah, so I think
in the
traveling
world
backwards
where
in time
U.S.
to,
interests
to
could
these
be
ancient times
particularly
of
threatened,
2018,
and then try to
what was
figure out
just the
which
technology
are
was
more
different. Not
important than
not
others,
just
so
that it
they
was
could
not
really,
as capable,
as I say,
but
focus
the
their
AI
attention on
systems
those
that people were using at the time
really
were qualitatively very different than
efforts
large
to
language
try to
models.
prevent or mitigate
And the deep learning revolution
these
had kicked
particular
off around
crises from
2012 with some
Now,
progress
before we get into
on
this year's
ImageNet,
report, I would
and
caveat
image
for listeners,
classification,
as you
data set
have
and
in the
challenge,
introduction, that
using
various
deep
considerations
neural
are off
nets,
limits,
so,
and that includes things like
deep
global
learning,
warming,
using neural networks
demographic change,
to
or
train
technological development.
neural
Those
networks
trends,
on
you write,
originally
which could easily
images
trigger violent
to
conflict,
then build
are simply too
classifiers
difficult
to
to judge over a
identify
short time
objects,
frame,
to identify
as you
that there
kind of
are
alluded to a
objects and
moment
classify what those
ago.
are.
Now, I'm wondering,
And that
kind of
brand of
kind of a
AI,
fine print preparation,
classifiers, was
were there
really
any notable preparations that were important to
the
square
bulk
away
of AI systems,
before handing
what
this
you would
poll
call
over to the
narrow
experts?
AI,
Well,
that we saw
as you indicate,
in that time frame.
made
And the
clear
huge
up front
sea change that
we
we've had over the last several years since
only,
then has
asked
been
respondents to the
starting
survey
originally
to
with
focus on relatively
GPT-2,
discrete
which I think among like the
contingencies
AI nerds
rather than
drew a lot of
broad
attention,
trends, as
less
you
so
say, like
the global scale
warming,
that ChatGPT
demographic
did.
changes,
Years later,
economic shocks,
the
things
development
like that,
of large
and
language
natural
models,
disasters.
and
They are
increasing the
just
general purpose
inherently
systems.
hard
And it's not just that,
to,
okay, well,
predict,
language
and
models
so,
can generate text, and that's
it's
interesting
really
and useful. It's
not
this
especially helpful to try to ask
significant
experts to give
expansion
a precise
of the scope of what AI systems can do
assessment of the
from doing
likelihood in the
like
coming
one
year,
thing
although they can
and doing
talk
it
broadly
sometimes
about
even
the
better than
potential
people,
impact.
whether it's identifying
And so
images
we
or back in
we
the
pulled
90s,
together 30 contingencies
something like
or potential
IBM's Deep
crises
Blue, which didn't use
that
deep
we
learning,
think
but
are plausible
was
for the
able
next 12
to
months.
play chess.
And
better
rather
than
than
humans,
choosing
Gary
these
Kasparov.
ourselves,
Today,
we
much
solicit
more general
input
purpose systems that can do a whole
from a
wide range of
broad
tasks.
range of experts
And we can get into a whole thing of
in
like,
general,
well, like how do you compare them against
before
humans?
we
And that's an
actually
interesting
pull
discussion,
together the
but
survey.
it is a
And then,
huge qualitative
we
difference
sort of boil
from,
down
say,
all the
7
various
years ago.
possibilities
I want to kind of transition
into
now
these
to, of
30
course, your
contingencies.
most recent book. And
it
that
is-
really
it
kind
is
of begins to
those
set the
that
stage
the
for the bigger
respondents
issues
to the
that
survey,
animate the way that I
tried
think
to
our
assess.
audience
Now to the
interacts with this
findings.
issue. Page
So in
2 of the
2023,
report
you
tells
published
us
your book, Four
the number of
Battlegrounds,
armed
about
conflicts
the AI
is now at
tech
its
race,
highest since the end of
which
World
is kind of
War
currently
II.
playing out largely between the U.S.
Let's
and China.
begin with those your experts
So
said had the
what
highest
can you
likelihood
share
in
from that book,
2026
and what have
highest
you learned
impact
since
on U.S.
about
interest? How we understand China is using this technology
Just to sort of
in
give
its
you a
various
kind of
applications.
macro overview.
Yeah, so I think,
of
what
the,
motivated me in
sort of
writing this
broad
book
takeaways
was
here.
discussions that had started underway in Washington.
This year,
honestly, around
we've
the
seen no
2017, 2018,
lessening
2019
of the
timeframe,
sort of,
kicked off in a big
high
way with the
level of
National Security
anxiety
Commission on
about,
AI, about this idea that, okay, the
future
U.S. and
conflict
China are in this
in
AI
the world.
competition. We have to
Of the
win.
30
Which,
contingencies,
yeah, I think everybody in Washington
5
agrees
were
on,
ranked as
and
having
generated
both
a lot of
high
ideas
likelihood
coming out
and
of
a high
different quarters,
impact
think tanks,
on
government,
on
and
U.S. interests.
commissions and other things about what we need to do.
This
I wanted
is
to take a step
the
back and
highest
just try to understand
level
what are we
that it's ever
competing
been.
in? Like what would it
And,
mean to compete in
28 out
AI?
of the 30
What is the nature of that
contingencies,
competition?
were
And
either ranked
a lot
as
of folks have compared
moderately or
AI
highly
to
likely to happen.
another
17
industrial revolution.
of them would also
Okay, if you buy
have a
that
moderate or high
comparison, and I
impact
think there's
on
some
U.S.
validity to
interests.
that.
So this is
We saw
an
that the
extraordinary
Industrial Revolution led to major shifts in global power
barometer,
as
if you
some
will,
countries
of
were able to
expert
capitalize on
sentiment
technology
about,
sooner and then translate that into
the coming
not just
12
economic
months
but also
and the
military
risk
power.
of violent
But also
conflict
that
in
the
the world
key
that could
metrics of power
harm
changed.
U.S. interests.
Coal and
Now,
steel
in the top
became key
10
inputs
or
of national
so
power.
of the
Manufacturing capacity became
results,
a key measure
we
of national
see,
power.
the
Oil
Middle East
became a
continuing to
geostrategic
play a
resource.
prominent
The countries are
role.
willing to fight wars
The
over.
prospects
And so
of
I want to
conflict
understand what
reigniting
was
in
the
the
nature
Gaza
of that
Strip,
competition in the age of AI. What are
things
those things that we
worsening
should
in
be
the West
competing
Bank,
over? And
tensions being reignited
at least this is
between
tapered off a little bit.
Israel
but there was a
and
period
Iran
of time
are all
where,
in the
idea
top
of
10.
data is the new oil,
As you would
in vogue.
expect,
And all these articles in the Economist and other places, data is
Russia,
the new oil.
Ukraine,
And
the
like you
possibility
get a
that
wave
will
about
not
9
only
months later of all
continue
these
but
articles.
also
Data is
grow a
not
lot
the new
worse,
oil.
escalate
Data is
in a
not like
variety of
oil. It's like
dangerous ways
obviously
is up there.
it's not the same thing.
Interestingly, but
oil
not
is valuable. Is data
probably
valuable? Yeah.
surprising
Like what's the
to most
similarities? What's
of
the
your
differences? But I
listeners,
wanted to take a step back.
Venezuela is in the top tier
And so I think
this
data is
year.
a key component of this competition.
The possibility
but
that the
clearly,
U.S. will
computing hardware
target
is one,
transnational
and that's
criminal
one that
groups,
we've seen
as we know
heat
it's
up
already
significantly
happening.
since
But,
I
this,
published
as many
the
of
book.
the
In fact,
respondents believe could lead
export
to
controls on
direct
chips were coming
strikes on
down as the book was like
Venezuela
in the
and,
final
the
stages of publication,
destabilization
and
of-
much to
of
the publisher's
Venezuelan
dismay, we started to
government.
jam in updates.
Another
text
notable,
into,
I think,
new
takeaway this
updates of
year
U.S. export controls
is the continuing
which might
concern
have seemed
about
arcane, but I was like,
political
this is really
violence
important. We need
and
to talk about this
popular
export
unrest
control,
in
this
the
new NVIDIA
United
chip.
States.
And that's become a big centerpiece of
In
competition.
previous years,
And then also talk in the book about
we would never
competition,
even
talent, which is of course
thought
really
to
critical.
consider this
And then in
as
institutions,
a
and basically
contingency to be included in the survey.
mechanisms
But
inside
as a result
US
of sort
military,
of
inside
public
the PLA,
pressure when we
to
solicited
take this technology
inputs
that's really
into
coming
the
out of the commercial
survey
sector
several
and
years
pull it
ago, we
into the
felt we
defense
had
sector
to
and then
include
translate that to military.
political violence in the
I remember
United
this. This was at
States.
the beginning of
And
the period
this year,
where big data was
for
like a hype
2026,
term.
it's
And
not
my
only
publisher
considered
back in
of
2014
high consequence to
was
the
like,
US,
everyone
but
wants to talk
also
about
highly
big data. I'm
likely,
like, yes,
even
but
though
you have to
it
talk
isn't a
about basically
presidential
the three
election year.
things
So
that are
that's
AI,
another,
which is
I
just
think,
compute,
quite
data,
significant
and math. And the math, there
takeaway
are,
from this
people are
year's
coming up
survey.
with new interpretations.
Yeah,
of
I
ensemble
find it
models all the time.
useful as it's
It's
broken
really
down into
just
various
derived from
tiers.
race. It's just really
Tier 1
the
being kind of more
alternative
concerning,
to
or maybe
basic regression
most,
statistics that allows you
tier
to
2 and 3 and
constantly
so
update.
on.
And all of these,
I
and
find
every
it
new
kind of
algorithm
interesting.
has
I
that as its like
was a 5-year Army veteran ending in
the
2012.
data is well.
I'd been
this is the
to
thing where
Afghanistan
Baiting
and
Light comes in. This is the type one,
very
but we
aware of
had
counterterrorism policies, and I noticed
activity across the Middle
a
East
few
where
of
the
those
United States was
conflicts were
collecting just,
in
hundreds
tier
and hundreds
2
of hours of video
category.
footage. And that would go to
Afghanistan,
analysts, and analysts would
I
sit
think
there
made it to tier
and try to
3,
do like
which of
pattern
course
of life
the U.S.
and
hasn't
figure out
had
which
troops
of the
there, and I
many
guess
people surveiller
we're
was
looking
surveilling
at
was the one who's going
4
to put
years
my
now.
ID somewhere.
Right.
And that is very
But we've also done some
and
lesser known
takes a long time and
conflicts
takes
that
a
I
lot of
probably couldn't explain
resources.
very well,
So there's a
like
technique
Haiti,
queuing,
that do show up
sort
in the
of thing that was
second
created to deal
tier.
with the data,
Is there much,
and that
was
later
there much
turned
that
into
the experts
the compute
sort
thing
of
is also really
elaborated
critical now.
upon,
This is
maybe
the dimension that
in terms of
AI
some of these
competition is taking
that
in
I've
terms of like
mentioned,
a material
the
competition for stuff that
counterterrorism
exists like on this
locations,
planet. But I also think
and
that the
or Haiti,
compute
or was it not
issue
really something, an
is
opportunity for them to elaborate
one
much at all?
that
They were
we
kind of
should,
more doing
the
a picking
military has a very
and a
particular
prioritizing.
sort of stake
Yeah,
in it that is
they're
different
really
from
given little
the way
opportunity
that
to
great big consumer-facing
explain
foundation
why they
models
made their
understand
assessment.
compute. So
They
they're
can
building
add,
up massive
by the
data
way,
centers, they're
other
getting lots of subsidies, they're
contingencies that
trading
they
like
think were
$800
not in
billion
the
between
survey.
themselves,
But
based mostly on
speaking
like
to
data center
what I
stuff.
think is your
And that's
general point,
because
in the
of
first,
the
I think
premise that
probably
more
10 years or
compute
so of the
and more data
survey,
will help you
in
do
the
sort of scale
aftermath
up the
of
performance of the
9/11,
foundation models. And
it's
while they did scale
the
up
abiding
faster than many
concern
people
was
appreciated,
very
faster than
much
even Moore's
driven
law,
by
there's some suggestion
threats
that
related
now
to the
that
global
scaling
war on
just
terror.
of that particular
For
way
year
of
after
developing
year, the
AI
possibility of another
through large language
9/11
models and stuff
attack,
has
type
plateaued.
attack
But
on
you're
the
not seeing that
US
in the same way.
was
This is,
always the number
and
one
you also see
concern.
that
And over the
there
last
is a finite
3-4
supply of like
years,
GPUs.
we've seen,
But Google
as
has
the
part of the reason there was a
global war
massive
on
sell-off
terror
in NVIDIA, part
wound
of the reason
down,
Peter
if
Thiel sold
that's
off all of his
the
stuff
right
is
way of
because Google
describing
has
it.
come up with an alternative. So there's going to be
Those
innovations
threats
there
or risks
that
definitely decreased.
keep pace.
And as I think I
turn
mentioned
that
in the
into a new
report,
fight
this
every
is the
day.
first
But
year
the thing about
that internal
compute
stability
aspect
in
of AI is that
Afghanistan, a
you
place
have
where
a
we
situation right
spent
now where these really large public companies,
close
these
to 2
foundation models
decades
that provide
fighting,
a service
is not even
that
in the report this year.
millions of people all around the world are
The
constantly using. They're
possibility
kind of
of
sucking up a
cross-border
lot
clashes
of the
between
attention. They
Afghanistan
kind of are
and
crowding out
Pakistan
entirely
is,
different
but internal
schools of,
developments
and
in
research
Afghanistan don't
areas
appear.
and available GPUs.
Somalia,
It
where
could go
there
to
are
a
still
different
U.S. Special
version of AI,
Forces operating, that's
very critical
down
for the
to
military,
tier
but the public
2.
doesn't really use
Other
it all. And it's
places
like
like
smaller.
Yemen,
It's like on
Lebanon,
platform, not
also
necessarily
tier
connected
2.
to big enterprise
And
cloud, et cetera, et cetera.
looking
AI,
at
which I call
those in
small
the
AI.
top tier,
And
there really isn't,
that,
frankly,
to
anything
me, something that
you would have
right now I don't see the Pentagon dealing with
in
as
the
well
early
as
years of the
they should.
survey. Sort of
Because
said, yeah, this is
actual
definitely
warfare is
part of
going
this,
to need a
this
combination
global
of
war
both
on
of these types.
terror.
And Paul
What's
weigh in
taken
on this
place
as
is
he's a much more
clearly
preeminent expert on it than I am.
increasing concern about
future warfare is going to require
interstate
both these types
conflict
of AI.
and
They're going to need distributed,
particularly
high
great power
autonomy that
conflict,
is
or the
not
U.S.
constantly
being
connected
in a
to a
war
cloud.
with Russia or China.
It exists on
And
platform C3PO.
Taiwan
There's
is up there
C3PO
in
AI.
tier 1. The possibility of,
and you're
as
going
I say,
to
the
need
Russia-Ukraine
mass
war
decision assistants that are also
escalating
working
in a
through big
dangerous
problems in
fashion,
logistics and
or
supply.
Russia
All of the time,
continuing its
reworking
provocations
scenarios
against
for what's
NATO countries,
dynamically changing on
which
the
could also
battlefield,
escalate
analyzing
and bring
all of
in
the
the
data
US.
collected
They're
off
all
of
now tier
everything on the
1.
battlefield,
These are
and
all
turning
very
that
much
into
front
useful
and center
updates, and
on
at some point
people's
through agentic AI actually like
radar
you need them
versus,
both.
as I say,
And
these
the
former
great
concerns
big
having
now
to do with
Silicon Valley
terrorism and
megafauna
militancy,
foundation
particularly in
model
the greater
companies
Middle
are
East.
kind of sucking some
Safeguarding
of the
America
innovation
requires
space. They're
speed.
sucking up the researchers.
It takes
They're kind of
tech,
determining
advanced tech,
the entire field of
defense
AI
tech,
research around
and it
them
depends on
to a certain
expertise.
extent. And they're
Lockheed
sucking up a lot
Martin's
of chips.
homeland
And
defense
that's
capabilities
actually a
aren't just
problem that I
layered
think
and
that the Pentagon
sophisticated.
has to deal
They're
with because there's not a
fielded,
lot of consumer
proven, and protecting lives
space
around
right
the
now. There's not a
globe.
massive
In
market
other
for
words,
small AI,
they're
for sure.
ready.
There
Ready to
will be
deliver
hopefully
mission integration
No,
on an
I think
unprecedented
this is such a
scale.
critical point
And
that one
so
that
are
you're
we.
making, which is that
Learn more at
both of these
lockheedmartin.com/Golden Dome.
And you'll hear this all the time, like you were saying, from
As we
companies.
noted earlier,
Oh, the future
the
is
report
big
lists
models,
that the number of armed
ever
conflicts
larger and
highest
larger and
since the
larger,
end of World
more
War II.
compute intensive.
But also the
models,
report
and that's the
cautions
future of
that
AI. That's what we're hearing from
relatedly, the Trump
leading labs.
administration has
And
also
then
systematically
a lot of other
dismantled
companies
the
that
very
can't compete
elements
in
of the
that
U.S.
space.
government
the future
dedicated
small
to strategic
models,
foresight,
it's too
conflict
expensive, and you
prevention,
can't
and
do
peace
that.
building, without
you realize
replacing
both
them
of those
with
things
anything
are
better.
true.
Related
There's some
funding has been
fascinating
slashed in the
work
process.
done
You're
by
right.
the AI research group
You, in
EPOC,
your role,
that's tracked
to what
a lot of
degree
the
did those
quantitative
sort of
measurements
considerations? I mean,
in
you
both
placed them rather
scaling
high in the
frontier
report.
models, but also
Does that kind of,
the,
does
sort of
that
miniaturization,
kind
if
of
you
sit
will,
with you
of
a little
models
differently
into more
this year,
efficiency. And
or at this particular
not
end of
only
this
is
year
there
as we
this
look into
exponential growth
the next
in the
1.5
amount of compute being
Definitely,
used in the
I'm
frontier
very
models.
concerned
And
about
not just
this.
in training, but of course increasingly in the inference side as well.
I'm sure
as we're
many
seeing
of your
more compute used
listeners
for inference.
are aware
But
the
there's
president
also
has
this
boasted
pattern
about
that we've
his
seen,
prowess
which is for
as
the data of exponential improvements
the
in
peacemaker in
efficiency of
chief,
models.
or
So once a model comes out, so like
very
GPT-4
successful
hits the shelf. Okay, so at the time that was the most advanced system.
Having settled
Then what we've seen in the data
8 conflicts
is
this year
9
alone.
months
It was
later,
repeated last
there'll
night
be a
in his
language model
address
released by that
to the
company or
nation.
somebody else
And
that is able to achieve
while
the same level
I
of
applaud his
performance
efforts to be known as a
half the amount of computing
peacemaker,
power.
and
then
I
9
think
months
in-
later,
in
after that,
some of the
another half.
cases,
So like the amount of
the
computing
role has
power
been
needed
generally
to achieve the
positive.
same level of performance is
we
halving
can
every 9
look
months.
at
Even if
Gaza
those numbers
and
move around a
think,
little
well,
bit,
is
the
it
point is
better
you're
now
seeing
than it
both of
was
these
6 months
trends.
ago?
And so
Yes,
like the
but it's
frontier of
hardly
AI
a
is needing
conflict
more and
that's
more data and
been
compute.
truly
But
settled
in any given moment,
as
the
the
amount of
president would
compute
have
need
us
for
believe.
certain level
And
of
that goes
capabilities drops
for
really
most of the
fast.
other 8
Makes it much more
7
accessible.
conflicts
And so
that
if you extrapolate that
he
forward, you
points
can
to
envision
as
a
being,
world where there might be,
as
if
being
this trend continues at the
champion of
frontier,
peace.
these like
Now,
really
the
expensive
main point, though,
models
is
to train
what
and to
you
run
alluded
that are
to at
doing
the outset.
like
That,
really
it's one thing
exquisite
trying
types
to
of
manage
intelligence,
conflict.
maybe in scientific
It's
research,
much better, however,
that
to
are
try
incredibly valuable.
to avert
But
them
on the
and
other
try
hand,
to head them
we
off.
might
And,
see
and,
the commodification of
and
sort of like
many of
routine
the parts
day-to-day
of the
intelligence
U.S.
is good
government that
enough
was
for a lot of what
dedicated to
people are
doing
doing,
just that.
where the cost of that kind of
Here I'm
intelligence
talking
drops
about
pretty close to zero. Much like if I get a
USAID,
Google
the
search,
Development
like, I don't have to
Assistance
pay for that.
Agency
Like that,
of the U.S.
the
government.
cost of just
There's
accessing
parts of the
Google search
State
information on the internet
Department that
is
were
like
also
really
dismantled.
and so I
Elements
think
of
both
the
of those things are
intelligence
real. And then there's a
community
question of
that,
okay, for an organization
had
like
the goal
US
of
military,
trying to
like,
look
how do
over
you
the
harness
horizon and
all of
pinpoint
those, because you want it
areas of
all,
concern.
and you want to feed it
They've
to
all
warfighters
been,
and then let people play with it and
as I say,
figure out how to
just
turn that to
dismantled
warfighting.
without anything in
and I think
place.
it also speaks to
So
right
you
now,
have to wonder: is there
business
any
model of some
kind
of
of
these larger
coherent
companies.
effort
And when you want to
to
understand what
look
an AI
ahead,
bubble looks
act
like, it
ahead,
looks like
to
companies
try
that
to
are based their
actually
current valuation
manage
on
the
reaching a certain
risks
performance
rather
point
than just
and having lots of like data
deal with their
based
consequences
agreements,
and hope for the best in peacemaking?
data center
I think
agreements in
your
play, and
listeners
that's
will know
the way
that
they justify their current
prevention is so
valuation
much
for the
better than
IPO or
cure.
whatever.
And
When,
while
in
it's
fact,
hard to prove
to your
how
point, like,
successful you
especially
are,
as
it's
the
still a
trend moves,
worthy
as it
goal.
obviously
And I
is,
just
towards open
don't
source
see
models,
this being a priority
then
of
that
the Trump
becomes,
administration.
I
It
think you'll
reminds
see
me
all
of
of
kind
those that you were just
of
talking about really
discussions, I
accelerate,
guess,
which
what
is
we're
probably
looking
a very
at
good
about
thing for
10
the United
years
States
ago
military.
now, about root causes when they would talk
does
about the
suggest
war
that
on
there's
ISIS and
that
the
some of the most
invasion of
innovative
Iraq
players
kind of
right now
metastasizing,
really are
right?
in a position where they're sort of obliged to
Well, my final question
fight against actual innovation. It's
actually
just,
kind of relates to
and yet,
the invasion of Iraq.
eventually they have to, in order to keep going,
to a degree,
So
anyway.
that's when OpenAI began
Amid all this
to,
forecasting,
after DeepSeek
I'm
came
reminded
out,
of a document
which
that
is
I often think
basically
about. We at
a
Defense
sort of
One
rip-off of
tried
them.
to focus on the
when they
future of
launched into
national
an entirely
security.
new
Right.
kind of
So
direction.
there was a
where they were
2001
going to
memo
partner with, like,
from
CND and
a
National
former
Labs, and
Pentagon
they were
official,
partnering with the
Lenton
military
Wells.
to do exactly this,
And Donald
like
Rumsfeld mentioned
custom-made,
this in a letter to the
like,
president
give them
in
weights,
April of
give
2001.
the military, give
And that letter was
Los
titled
Alamos
Predicting the Future.
NCD
And I'm
National
just
Labs,
going to
give
read a
weights
few
to their-
lines of
to
it
their
because no
models,
doubt
and
you will
then
get the
work with
idea,
people on site that have
and
very
indeed you probably
particular,
already know where I'm going with
problems
this.
that are
But
very
it says,
complex. The U.S. military is a good
it's
example
thoughts
of that.
for the 2001
And then
Quadrennial
work with
Defense
them
Review.
to
It begins,
run all of that
if you had been a
whatever
security
that
policymaker
customer
in the
brings
world's
terms
greatest
of
power in
energy
1900,
capability, and energy source, and
you would have been a
data
Brit
center.
looking
So they're
warily
actually
at your
making their
age-old
big
enemy
AI
France.
smaller too now.
By 1910,
but it's only as
you would be
small as,
allied
like,
with
the
France, and your
military.
enemy would be Germany.
So I see
By
it's a fascinating
1920,
space right now.
World War
but you see
I
that,
would
like,
have been
a lot of the way
fought
we
and
think
won,
about,
and
some
you'd be
of this
engaged
stuff
in a
at this
naval arms
moment,
race with your erstwhile
especially in terms
allies,
of
the
the
U.S. and
valuation of some of
Japan.
these companies,
By
is so
1930,
transitory. It's
naval
so,
arms
it's moving,
limitation
like, just
treaties
so
were in
quick.
effect. The Great Depression I was wanted to point underway, out just two recent and headlines. The Defense Planning Standard said, no war for 10 years.
I'll let Paul or whoever
9
wants
years
to go
later,
from here, but they're headlines
World
that I
War
saw in
II
the
had
last
begun.
2 weeks. From
And
late
I'll stop
November,
there. There's a whole series of bullets along this point.
Investors expect
and I always
AI
like
to
that
soar.
because it
Yeah,
is a
but
reminder,
that's not
right?
happening.
Like you cannot, not that
And
anyone
just last
says
week
we
in
can,
futurism,
but you cannot predict
the
the
number
future,
of people
even though
using
we're
AI at
trying
work
to do the
is
best we
suddenly
can to
falling.
minimize, I guess,
So I find those
death
sort of
and
trends kind of
destruction, I
interesting,
guess,
of course,
you
in
know,
light
to
of our
put it
conversations
crudely.
here. And of course, we've got two different paths.
Now you've been
that
doing
we're
this
talking
for, of
about,
course,
military and civilian.
we're
and
looking
these
at
are, of
almost
course,
2
civilian
decades. And
applications.
granted,
But I
you're
find
working
that
on an annual
kind of-
basis, while
I find
Lynn
those
Wells
fascinating.
was
Yeah.
talking about 10-year
Yeah.
intervals.
I remember back when, like,
Still, have there been any particularly
2002,
impactful
everyone was
like
God, the
curveballs
internet
or
is nothing but,
post-report
like, a weird
developments that
site
stand
where
out for
can
you
buy
since you've been
secondhand,
involved in these
like,
annual
Pez
surveys?
dispensers and stuff. Like
I
this
think
this
that
hype
your-
thing is
your general
crazy
point
right now
that,
on this.
you know,
I feel like it's bullshit.
trying to
I'm not
predict
even
the
going there.
future.
And
is
yeah, it turns out that
false
people
is
actually did
correct.
figure out new stuff to
And
use.
just
it
to
for.
be clear,
But
the survey
it's,
doesn't
what I like about what
actually
the DMV is
forecast
doing
or
right now
predict
is they,
anything. It just
under
tries
research
to
and engineering,
gauge
they are
the
moving out
sentiment of
with
experts about
new,
the risk,
basically
the
just tools that
relative
are available to
likelihood
everybody,
of certain
so that people
concerns,
can figure out how to build a relationship
and do
with
so
AI
over a
on a very
relatively short
day-to-day,
time
person-to-person,
frame, because
like person-to-machine
as you
thing.
rightly
And that's
point
kind of
out,
unique to the U.S. military's
a
approach
lot
to AI.
can
That gives
change,
me,
and lots
I
changed
hope
just
the
this
free world to me
last 12
assurance
months,
about the way the U.S. is
and
developed
so
and uses
we
AI in
think
military
that probably
constructs as
12
opposed to
months
China and
is
Russia.
the maximum time frame that
Sure.
you
Yeah.
could really
I mean, I
have
think
any
like if you pull a thread on what
level
you
of
were
confidence
talking about
what's
here about this
kind of round the
rapid
corner.
proliferation of the
Now, in
technology,
terms
whether
of
it's DeepSeek
surprises,
or some other kinds of models. Alibaba also
I've been
releasing
struck,
models out of China.
particularly just this last
To me,
year,
one of the
by,
takeaways is that even if
the
U.S.
degree to
labs
which,
stay right at the forefront of this
prevailing
technology,
norms about the use of
Chinese
force
labs
in
are
the
like
world,
single-digit
which,
months behind.
I took
And
for,
whether that's like 2
for
months or
granted as
9
being
months,
pretty
I'm not sure that
robust,
at the end of the
have
day
weakened
it
incredibly.
translates
just
that
this
lead
last
alone
year.
translates to a meaningful military
One of my
advantage
assistants
if the
pointed
Pentagon
out that,
is charitably
9
5
capital
years behind
cities in the world
the frontier.
have been
Right?
attacked by other
And
countries
so
over the
my
last 12
takeaway
months.
is,
9
yeah, great that
capital
we have U.S.
cities.
companies in the lead and we want to be building out
I
infrastructure
would
and the
not
energy
have
support it, and that's all
imagined,
good.
given
But we've got to
these
find
normative
ways to
constraints on the use of
rapidly
force, that
translate
we would ever see
that
that. Including some of
technology
them have been,
into some kind
it's not
of
just,
actual military advantage.
covert action
And that,
or
putting it in the hands of
disinformation. It's
warfighters is
actually
really great. I'm glad to see the military moving out on that. But it requires this
missiles and cruise
iterative. I mean, one of the things that's very clear looking at historical examples of disruptive technologies is giving people the widget is not enough.
Yeah, that is a chilling statistic that I don't think that I either
figure out
had
how to use it
taken into
effectively.
consideration.
It requires people to
before speaking with you
transform
today.
their military operations.
Paul Stairs is a senior fellow at the Center for Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And that's going to be
latest
hard.
report on
And I think
conflicts to watch in
that's
2026
a
is
longer-term
available
process,
online
and it's
now.
one that
Paul, thank you
I think we
so
should
much
be
for speaking with
realistic
me.
about
I
the
really
fact
appreciate it.
that we are
same
competing on a
here.
pretty level playing field against the PLO. And in order to win that competition,
Well, that's it for us this
we're going to have
episode.
to find ways
Thanks
to
for listening.
actually be
And until next
innovative and bring in the tech and be disruptive inside the U.S. military.
Keeping America
in ways
secure
that,
starts in
sometimes gonna
space,
break
where
China
we
and
can
people
see
aren't
the
gonna
whole
like.
picture
But
and
that's what's going to
connect
take
it.
to
From
maintain a
threats
military advantage.
to targets, from land to
America's
sky
defense
to sea.
strength comes
At
from the
Lockheed
people who
Martin,
build.
taking homeland
Welders,
defense to the next level
machinists,
doesn't
and
mean
others
starting
who
from
produce the
scratch.
equipment
It
our
means
military
starting
relies
from
on.
space.
And while
A
demand
domain
is
where we've
rising,
helped
the
achieve
number
mission
of
success
skilled
for
workers
decades.
hasn't. But the
We're
GE
ready
Aerospace
now.
Foundation
Learn
and the
more at
company are stepping out. The
lockheedmartin.com/Golden
foundation
Dome.
is launching a $30 million